Okay, so the first few ones were largely about the matching section, but it also, I was sprinkling in some examples of multiple choice questions in there. What I'm gonna do now is just kinda ask some general questions tied to the multiple choice. Basically reword some of the multiple choice questions as examples. And then I'll get into some examples of the questions where it gives you a statement and you have to relate it to a theory, okay? So, who was the guy that came up with the conflict perspective?
Marx.
Karl Marx, right? What book laid that out?
Manifesto.
Communist Manifesto, yep. Who was give me an example of a person, an early functionalist.
Durkheim.
Durkheim, Robert Merton, yep. And then, C. Wright Mills, Charles Horton Cooley, George Herbert Mead, they came up with which theory?
SI.
SI theory, yep.
You're gonna have to know them, or like.
Well, again, I'm not gonna read you the question literally, but knowing the people in which
Can you
theory.
repeat, like,
Yeah,
just
can you
like, how many of
repeat
those
those
people?
Yeah, so Merton, remember Merton talked about strain theory, and then Merton, M-E-R-T-O-N, okay, Merton, yeah. He talked about strain theory, but he also talked about manifest and latent function, right? Durkheim, you remember he studied social integration, that was a big part of what Durkheim studied. So Durkheim found that the more socially integrated you are, the less likely you are to do what? Commit suicide, yeah. And then George Herbert Mead talked about what he called the I and the me with the social construction of reality, okay? Let's see. What's one criticism of functionalism? Like, what would critics of functionalism say? Let's be more specific. Why would conflict theorists say that functionalism isn't 100% correct?
Because it like ignores the oppression people can face or something.
Yeah, it assumes that stuff is functional, right? It assumes that there's a purpose. Functionalism assumes that if something is working for the most people, then it's like good or whatever. So then how would functionalists criticize conflict theorists?
It assumes everything is designed to oppress.
Yeah, basically the flip side, right? Functionalists would say, hey, religion isn't all bad, to use religion as an example, right? Like conflict theorists, remember Marx called religion the opium of the masses. So Marx is like, religion is a tool that wealthy people use to control others. Look at the French Revolution, if you remember that from sophomore year. You had the three estates, the first, second, and third estate. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobles and army officers, and then the third estate was everybody else. So the first and second estates basically worked together to make sure that they didn't have to pay taxes, and then Robespierre and the other revolutionaries were like, religion is bad, so they literally tried to destroy religion in France. That process was called de-Christianization, right? They basically went hardcore conflict theory before Marx was born. I'm pretty sure Marx wasn't alive then. If he was like very young. So the critique that functionalists would say would be like, hey, people need religion, it does something, it helps society to operate. What is it called when like if I'm like, well, this is the best way to do things, you should all do this, live like us here, America, right? Okay, what is that? What am I being? If you're judging your or other societies by your own cultural standards. That's called being ethnocentric, okay? Okay, what if I get into a debate with somebody about like how important, like I'm like, hey, I got this family, it's like John, Susie, and Sarah, and they're all really smart. The reason they're all real smart is because their parents passed on their genes. And then somebody else is like, no, it's not, it's because they had a really good first grade teacher and like they were in a bunch of clubs that helped them to learn. What's that debate called? Nature versus nurture, yeah. okay, let's say, if you go to a basketball game, or let's use football games, because that's a better example. And there's kids like watching the game, and then they're watching the game, and then when the game starts, they start playing, and then they like start emulating the other people that they want to be like eventually. They role play and act like them. What's that an example of? What type of socialization? It's a way that you learn, you kind of act out to eventually achieve a desired social position. I remember really emphasizing this with one of our music video analysis. That's called anticipatory socialization.
Can you repeat the definition again?
Yeah, anticipatory socialization is learning that people engage in, which helps them to like build towards a desired social position. So I tell the story frequently about my BFF when I was like 6 years old. Next door neighbor named Danya. Have I talked about Danya before?
Yes.
Yep. So I hadn't seen her for, 13, 14 years. This was probably 10 years ago. And then when I saw her, was it a custodian or something? Yeah. Randomly I got a phone call and it's like, hello, and I was like, yeah, this was, again, like my second year of teaching. And it's like, this is Meryl Falstrom, you remember me? It was Danny's mom. I was like, oh yeah. She's like, we need help. Danny needs to move. Can you come over and help her move? I'm like, yeah, of course. And I walked in and I was like, whoa. Like, she was like, Danny was like tiny. She was way shorter than I remember and looked a lot different and everything. And it was interesting. So yeah, that was, the story I tell with her often is when we were 6, like I remember playing kickball in their yard, like they had the yard kind of between our houses that was bigger. We'd play kickball and then we'd play house. And Danny was the oldest and she's like, you're the dad, I'm the mom. Okay, tell the kids, hurry up to supper, you're gonna get a spanking. And then I'd go to supper, you're gonna get a spanking. And then my sister who's 4 is like, you can't spank me. And I'm like, I'm the dad, yes I can, you know? And so like we were role playing being parents, right? That was an example of anticipatory socialization, okay? See, I already talked about a lot of these already. What are efforts that we have, that we go through where we're like trying to make other people think of us in a certain way? So,
Looking less self.
that's the theory that guides it, you're correct. And the last word is self in there. So,
Presentation.
presentation of self, yep. So if you're trying to figure, you're gonna go interview for a job, you wanna kinda dress like they do, right, act like they do, like that's presentation of self. If I tell you a joke, but you don't really understand, you don't get the joke, why don't you get it? Why don't you understand it?
Then a reality, right?
You don't understand the two realities being presented, yeah. About what percentage of the population identifies themselves as homosexual? Too high.
5.
Yeah, it depends on the survey, but you're gonna see like 3, 4, 5%, depends on how it's worded, okay? Cause sometimes, some researchers will say, have you ever had a homosexual experience, ever at all?
In like America or like?
In the United States,
And then
yeah.
every 14-year-old
seems really
girl
low.
says yes.
Stereotype,
It
right
is,
there,
but-
yeah. Okay, so, but if the question is worded that way, if they say, have you ever had a homosexual experience? Ever kissed somebody of the same sex, at all? Or do you identify yourself currently as homosexual, which one's gonna have a higher number?
The ever.
The ever, have you ever done it, yeah, or ever identified yourself that way, right? Okay, for social control and Hershey's control theory, we talked about that before. What does Hershey's control theory rely on to make people not be deviant? It relies on people anticipating the potential consequences. What's the Davis-Moore thesis state? Davis-Moore thesis is a functional thesis that tries to explain stratification and wealth distribution. What does it state? Okay, the greater the functional importance of a job in society, yeah, some of you are pointing up, the greater the financial rewards attached to it, right? That's what the Davis-Moore thesis says. So we pay doctors a lot because we want to make sure if we break our arm, we go to a doctor that knows what they're doing, right? We pay teachers not as well because that doesn't really matter, right?
So like greater the importance.
The greater the functional importance of an occupation in society, the more financial rewards attached to it. Because society wants to draw talented people into that field, right? That's the Davis-Moore thesis. Talked about that, talked about that. Talked about that. What's happened to the gap between the rich and poor nations?
Bigger.
It's getting bigger, but in terms of absolute poverty, what has happened to the poor nations? There's less absolute poverty, yep. What is the trend by which people are moving from small towns towards big towns called?
Urbanization.
What is the term for those small towns?
Rural.
Rural, yeah. Give me an example of some pink collar occupations.
Teacher.
Receptionist, teacher, especially elementary, nurse, dental assistant or hygienist, right? What is the type of segregation that exists by law called?
Gender.
If it's by law versus in fact. Maybe I should delete that one. I don't know if that's in the new book or not. That's de jure versus de facto discrimination.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
I think
I learned
I've
that
heard
last
you say
year.
it before, but I haven't.
Yeah, you might have learned it in government. They talk about that in
Yeah,
government
it's
a lot.
government, that was-
Yeah.
Yeah, take it out. Or put it in because we know it now.
Yeah. What's the educational practice, and it happens in businesses also, where they kind of give an edge to minorities to try to encourage diversity and correct past injustice? Called what? Affirmative action, yep.
Guys, we presented about it. You were all paying attention.
Which sector of the economy is arguably the most important in North Dakota because of oil and crops?
Primary.
Prom graduation ceremonies, watching the Super Bowl, those are all examples of a quasi-religious experience that's called what? I know this is in the reading, and I meant, that's called a civil religion.
Which is what?
Civil religious ceremonies are like, they're things that are like borderline sacred, basically. So they're not traditionally tied to religion, like there's no like church of graduation ceremonies, right? But like it's still a kind of a sacred thing, right? Going to prom, there's like very strong rituals tied to prom. You know, you have to bring the flowers for your date, you gotta go with your friends, and you gotta take pictures as groups. You got all this stuff you have to do with prom, and if you don't do it right, it's like very offensive, right? Talked about that, talked about that. Okay, let's go through the section where it gives you some quotes and you have to identify which theory matches those quotes, okay? Let's say people that, I'm just gonna give you a statement, you have to identify which of the four main theories relates, right? Individuals that decide to like not get married and like go to bars and hook up with random people, they do so because they interpret the risks worth the reward. Exchange theory. Yep, they're weighing the pros and the cons, right? Okay, if those people, like the norms around sexuality exist, and punish those people that do that in a variety of ways because their behavior promotes instability in society. Functionalism, yep. People break up because their needs aren't met. Exchange, right? Weighing the pros and cons, right? Going to church is perceived as really important to your mom, but you don't really care about it that much. SI, you perceive it as different, right? People choose to move to cities, even though the cost of living is more. Individuals choose to move to cities because they're a long ways from their family, but they like the city life and the downtown and the ability to go to concerts. Exchange, right? Low graduation rates amongst males, because males like graduate worse than females, right? And they're suspended higher. That's because groups in power oppress them. Conflict, right? Okay, this is a Confucius quote. If there's order in the home, there will be order in the town. If there's order in the town, there will be order in the nation. And if there's order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. Functionalism. The primary purpose of the family is to raise children. Functionalism. Okay. You are what you believe you are. SI theory. Government's first duty is to protect its citizens. Functionalism, yeah. Men as a group should not have an opinion on abortion because it's a women's rights issue. Conflict theory, yeah. Do you think those are easy or not really?
Easy, but it's
Yeah, okay. All right, if you have any other you can hit stop. If you have any other questions,